Hello, my name is Susie Stern, and as board chair of Jewish Democratic Council of America, JDCA, I want to thank the hundreds of you joining today's program, Israel at War and the Role of the United States, with our guests, former Deputy Assistant of Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, Dana Stroul, and former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Dan Shapiro. This is an incredibly difficult moment for the vast majority of American Jews. Following nearly 12 days of Iranian missiles targeting population centers in Israel and at least one U.S. military base in the region, we are incredibly relieved to see a ceasefire has taken hold in the past 24 hours. As the situation continues to unfold, we remain steadfast in our values, our staunch support of Israel's security and its right to self-defense, and our strong belief that Iran should never be able to acquire a nuclear weapon. At the same time, we are deeply concerned about the safety of U.S. troops and diplomats and the Israeli people and Jews literally around the world. We are also concerned that President Trump lacks a clear strategy about what happens next, especially if events do not unfold as he spontaneously decrees on Truth Social. Iran's nuclear weapons program poses a grave threat to the United States' interests and an existential threat to Israel. And the world is far better off without them, with the looming possibility of Iran having nuclear weapons, no question about it. President Trump claims U.S. strikes have destroyed Iran's nuclear capability, but members of the United States intelligence community, as most of you have heard, are apparently reporting that the U.S. strike has only delayed Iran's nuclear program for a few months. It is unclear what nuclear material Iran was able to preserve and move, or how long it might take to reconstitute its infrastructure and stockpile. This all amounts to the reality that additional work remains to be done to ensure the U.S. and Israel are no longer facing the looming threat of a potentially nuclear Iran. We continue to hope for a diplomatic end to this conflict, the end of Iran's nuclear ambitions, and the safety and security for Americans, Israelis, and all innocent civilians in Israel and around the globe. But achieving these goals requires strong, decisive leadership, working with allies and regional partners, and a clear strategy about what happens next. And this kind of leadership is not known to exist in the White House. At this moment, there are more questions than answers, and fortunately today, we are joined by two experts who will help make sense of what has happened so far and what the role of the United States may be in the coming weeks and months. I would like to first welcome Dana Stroul. Dana is the current research director at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Middle East, where she helped shape U.S. defense policy towards Israel, Iran, and the broader region. Dana, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm now pleased to hand things over to our JDCA CEO Halie Soifer to moderate today's discussion. Halie?
Thank you, Susie, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. Special thanks to Dana for joining us to share her insight. So Dana, we'll just get right into it. Israel has considered strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities for years. What do you think prompted the Israelis to attack, as they did just a little less than 2 weeks ago, in this moment? In particular, what was their assessment of the strength at that point of Iran's nuclear program in the lead up to their strike? And do you think that that was an accurate assessment of where Iran was when it comes to its nuclear program?
Well, first of all, a pleasure to be with all of you today, especially with Halie, former colleague from the Senate, and with JDCA. Thank you all, and thank you for the intro, Susie, and the important work that you all are doing. So I think there are three areas that are important to frame about that get us to the question and decision point of Israel to launch its operations inside Iran when it did. The first one is the post-October 7th, 2023 strategic environment. So after the Hamas attack of October 7th, the risk tolerance in Israel for the constellation of threats that it was facing from Iran just changed, and the strategic environment changed. So coming into this year, the dismantling and decimation of Hamas in Gaza, the dismantling and decimation of Hezbollah and Lebanon. In the case of Lebanon, Hezbollah under such significant pressure, so much of its weapons cache and its senior leaders gone, that the group actually delinked itself from Hamas and Gaza, declared a ceasefire on terms incredibly advantageous to Israel, and has essentially taken a knee and not been involved in anything since it declared the ceasefire, even though the IDF continue basically daily strikes on Hezbollah interest personnel, weapons transfers, etc. Then there's Bashar al-Assad in Syria. So this was the state partner of Iran, who willingly allowed Iran to use Syrian territory for the arming, training, funding, and transfer of weapons to Hezbollah, to its threat network. Bashar al-Assad is gone. There's new leadership in Damascus who actually are taking on Hezbollah-affiliated networks, saying Syrian territory cannot be used by Iran to proliferate instability across the region. And then, of course, there's still ongoing challenges with the Houthis in Yemen and ongoing challenges with the Iraqi militias. But we've even seen the Iraqi militias in a post-October 7th environment, essentially out of concern for being next on Israel's hit list, to basically take a knee and not continue and participate in attacks in that ring of fire that Israel was so concerned about. So Israel, looking out at the multiple fronts of Iran threats after October 7th, did just an incredibly impressive job using military force to systematically dismantle the threats that were facing it. And moreover, 2024 was just incredibly significant in the ways the goalpost moved for the use of direct military exchanges between Israel and Iran. So twice in 2024, Iran attacked Israel directly and overtly and claimed credit for it. The first one, of course, was April of last year, a combination of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and attack drones. And in that case, we actually had a multilateral air defense coalition with American, Arab, European, and Israeli participation all working together to defeat that attack. And in October of last year, Iran sent 180 ballistic missiles toward Israel. And in that case, the United States did support Israel's defense, but Israel was basically able on its own to defeat the majority of that ballistic missile attack. And twice last year, Israel responded by striking inside Iran without escalating to full-scale regional war a la World War III, which is what everyone has been so concerned about when thinking about an escalation between Israel and Iran. So in all of these ways, one, how Iran could have continued to threaten Israel through its network of terrorists and proxies, really, really degraded. The threat of Iranian ballistic missiles raining down on Israeli society in a way that would completely paralyze the country. Proof of concept last year that that was not the case. And again, even now we've seen Israel respond incredibly effectively with its own layered air defense to those attacks. And three, the fear barrier of Israel taking strikes inside Iran totally lowered. So strategic environment changed, risk tolerance from an Israeli perspective for Iran continuing to reconstitute these kinds of threats totally gone post-October 7th. Number one. Number two, I think there was deep concern inside Israel about the trajectory of the diplomacy being pursued by the Trump administration for the first 5 months of this administration. So based on public reporting, what we know is that President Trump told Prime Minister Netanyahu earlier this year that he wanted to explore diplomacy with Iran to address its nuclear program. He did not want the Israelis striking Iran, and he was not ready to consider U.S. military force inside Iran. But based on all of the public reporting, it broadly appeared that what the Trump administration was negotiating was basically a version of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal of 2015, which had sunsets on whatever Iran agreed to and allowed Iran to continue a domestic uranium enrichment program and did not require Iran to dismantle any of its nuclear facilities. And the big concern, especially from an Israeli perspective, with the Iran nuclear agreement as it was in 2015, is that Iran still had a pathway to a nuclear weapon should it make the political decision to do so. So I think it's fair to say, in terms of this second category that was driving Israel to strike when it did, that had it had confidence in the trajectory and the scope of that diplomacy being pursued by the Trump administration, it would not have felt the need to strike when it did. And number three is deadlines. There were just a lot of deadlines coming up this year, and it was unclear that the international community was going to come together and meaningfully roll back Iran's program. That Iran nuclear deal from 2015, the UN Security Council resolution that brought it into force internationally, and all the remaining restrictions on the program were going to expire this October. And apparently the Israelis had seen the Iranians be able to reconstitute and rebuild very quickly some of the damage from Israeli strikes inside Iran in 2024. So things were just moving very, very fast. Finally, one final point on the deadlines. There is a series of open source reporting that suggests the Iranians were moving even faster to that nuclear breakout this year. The first is the same week as the Israeli operation started, the IAEA Board of Governors had their big meeting, and the Director General of the IAEA, Rafael Grossi, specifically says in publicly available remarks, there is no peaceful explanation for the steps Iran is taking on its nuclear program. And only about 1 month before that, you had the Director of National Intelligence here, Tulsi Gabbard, specifically talk about the Iranians continuing to take preparatory technical steps to better position their program should the political decision be made to cross that nuclear threshold. And then finally, what we don't know is that there is apparently some additional Israeli intel that made them very concerned in a short time window. While we don't specifically know what that intelligence is, if there was something that suggested the political decision was about to be made or had already been made, building on everything else I just talked about prior to that, all of this together would definitely have raised alarms in Jerusalem and should be raising alarms in Washington that the trajectory of those nuclear negotiations were insufficient for the urgency of the moment.
Thank you. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that Israel was close to achieving its objectives in Iran before the U.S. got involved on Saturday. Was this the case? And if so, what did you make of Trump's decision to engage the U.S. military in direct strikes on 3 Iranian nuclear facilities? What do you think led President Trump to take this action?
Well, first of all, if Prime Minister Netanyahu and the IDF were to have said, we started this campaign, but we cannot finish it without the United States, that would be such a shift in Israeli strategic doctrine, which has always been that Israel will be able to defend itself by itself. But what is different here in this case is that the United States has certain weapons platforms and certain munitions that it has not transferred to Israel. Now, in terms of what the IDF has demonstrated in their military operations over the past year, I think what we're seeing is this is the most professional, most capable military in the region, enabled by absolutely exquisite intelligence. Think about the pager walkie-talkie operation in Lebanon, the very precise targeted killings of Hezbollah leaders, the very precise targeting of Iranian proliferation of weapons across Syria, the pinpoint killing of Ismail Haniyeh in a VIP guest house in downtown Tehran. So one is we've seen a military and a security establishment utilize exquisite intelligence and emerging technologies and accomplish its security objectives, not with overwhelming conventional means, which is how you saw the U.S. military approach this challenge set over the weekend. So I'm fairly confident that Israel had ways of addressing the rest of its objectives in the campaign in Iran, which was to dismantle, destroy, and eliminate as much of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, missile infrastructure, and air defense as possible. But what I think is different for Trump at this point in time is that the Israelis had done so much of the operations inside Lebanon. Air defense, mostly gone. Missile launchers, mostly gone. The command and control of Iran's security forces, really, really degraded. So by the time US forces entered, what we know is that the IDF were doing operations, cleared the airspace, the US Air Force goes in, drops munitions on 3 very specific nuclear enrichment facilities in Iran, flies back out, and then safely after that, the IDF begin their operations again inside Iran. So I think Israel probably had its own ways of doing this, but certainly President Trump saw an opportunity given the operational and battlefield achievements that the IDF had already made and knew that he could execute this, back up what the past 5 presidential administrations have all said. We prefer diplomacy, but military options are always on the table should diplomacy fail. And Donald Trump gets to be the one that says, well, I executed the military option. So I think he perceived that the Israelis were making outstanding progress militarily and wanted a piece of the action.
As someone who knows exactly what went into this planning, as someone who previously worked at the Department of Defense, do you think the U.S. strikes on the Iranian nuclear facilities were successful?
So there's 2 parts to this question. The first is part of my job in the Pentagon was to make sure that the United States military has the partnerships, the capabilities, the munitions, the intelligence support to take military action should the president direct it. So the job of the Pentagon is to have military plans for whatever crisis or contingency the president might need or might need to respond to. And what we saw over this past weekend with the US strikes inside Iran did not happen magically in 1 week or 2 weeks or even in the past 5 months. This is the result of years of investment, both in our Air Force, our platforms, our munitions, and then very specifically after October 7th, a lot of deepening military and intelligence cooperation between the United States and Israel, and also just the United States on its own to make sure that should Iran decide to rush for that nuclear weapon as the other pillars of its power projection, the terrorist network and the ballistic missiles were being decimated, that we had ways to respond. And I, am proud to have been part of a team that prepared these kinds of options so that the Trump administration could make these decisions if they determined that that is what was necessary. In terms of whether or not these military operations achieve what they set out to do, I think it's important to differentiate operational objectives from strategic objectives. So operationally, the plans that we just saw the US military execute and the munitions that we just saw the US military use, these MOPs, the massive ordnance penetrators, performed exactly as we would want them to perform. They were able to get inside Iranian airspace, deliver their munitions at the location and at the time of our choosing, and get out safely without the loss of 1 US service member, 1 US fighter aircraft, etc. So operationally, that is mission success. But strategically, I think it remains to be seen. Military force is not an end in and of itself. The point of using military force should be because there was an impasse in the negotiations with Iran and the world about the disposition of its nuclear program. And so military force was needed in order to improve the negotiating environment on the other side. And that, I think, is the big question right now. What we have is a ceasefire. We don't know what the next step is in negotiations. What we do know is that the entire Iranian nuclear program has not been eliminated. There are still things that exist, including the location and disposition of its stockpile of enriched uranium. And that's not something that has a military answer. It's going to require inspectors on the ground. It's going to require skilled diplomats negotiating on that framework. And those are the answers and the urgency that we don't have right now from the Trump administration.
Just building on that, you have also written about this, that previous U.S. administrations and leaders on both sides of the aisles here in the U.S. had hoped that diplomacy and negotiations over military force would be successful in dismantling Iran's nuclear program, but clearly it has not been until this point. Now that we have used military force, what are the key components of a successful diplomatic approach that can ensure that the ceasefire that is now held for, I don't know, not even 24 hours, I guess 24 hours exactly, that we can ensure that the ceasefire holds?
Well, first of all, there's some unknowns about the ceasefire itself that I think need to be developed very, very quickly. In terms of a ceasefire, what we have is President Trump announcing it and Iran and Israel agreeing to it. We haven't seen a piece of paper. We don't know the terms of reference. We don't know who is responsible for arbitration of accusations of violations. We don't know what the agreement is for the kinds of actions that will be taken if somebody is found to be cheating. And of course, here, I think the big concern is that the Iranian regime agreed to the ceasefire because they were under significant military pressure and saw all the elements of the regime's security establishment, its military industrial complex, its nuclear facilities, its air defense, its missile launchers, and even its people, both the nuclear scientists and the security leaders, being eliminated really, really quickly, and it needed relief. But the regime is still intact, and their strategic ambitions probably haven't changed. In fact, it's possible, a big risk is that the lesson of this military campaign is that now they actually have to move to covert means to rush for that nuclear weapon. So if they're cheating, what is going to take place? Is the United States going to endorse further Israeli military strikes? Are additional US military strikes on the table? Those are big unknowns that definitely need to be developed. And then the next really important element here is, how do we leverage the military pressure of the moment to have a better trajectory for negotiations? Historically, Iran has been more willing to negotiate and make meaningful concessions when it perceives itself to be isolated, diplomatically, politically, on the international stage. So the G7 statement coming out of Canada last week that underscored Iran as the driver of instability in the Middle East and Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, really important. I would hope that we'd see something very similar from the NATO summit this week. We should immediately be coordinating with the E3, London, Paris, and Germany. And frankly, this is an important time to actually be talking to Moscow and Beijing, who I assume share an interest in Iran not having a nuclear weapon. So that international coordination and urgency and diplomacy, and also working with the IAEA, because we need to get those inspectors on the ground, are critical elements of what we would want to see in the coming days and weeks.
Okay, final question, Dana. There has been a robust debate, certainly since Saturday night, across the American political spectrum over the constitutionality of Trump's strikes without congressional approval. How do you see this unfolding in the coming weeks? There will likely be a vote in Congress on a war powers resolution that requires the administration to receive congressional authorization for the use of force. But with a ceasefire in place, what should we expect to see in terms of this vote and this debate?
Well, first of all, I think that congressional support, and when we make a decision to use military force, that Congress being briefed and understanding the stakes is absolutely critical. Seems obvious, but I think worth repeating that Congress is a separate and co-equal branch of government, and they are the representatives of the American people at, both in the Senate and the House, the state level and the district level. A decision to use military force and put the lives of U.S. service members at risk is the most consequential decision that any American president can make. And members of Congress deserve to understand the stakes, the intelligence, and why any American president would decide to enter into hostilities in this case and any other location. So I think it's disappointing, in fact, alarming, that members of Congress have not received intelligence briefings about exactly what the intelligence laydown was, nor have they received an intelligence briefing about the battle damage assessment, so what these military operations achieved and the views of the president. And they should also be very well briefed on the decision tree, the following decisions that President Trump and his national security team might make about needing to use military force again, or exactly what the parameters are of a nuclear agreement with Iran that they will seek going forward. This is about, at its core, American security, the safety of our homeland and our people here, and also about how we pursue that through security and stability and peace in the Middle East. And so it's that strategy and that articulation of exactly how military force gets us to a better diplomatic outcome that is missing from the Trump administration now. I am more humble than to predict what will happen in Congress in terms of taking these votes, but I do think it's incredibly important that there be a healthy and rigorous debate in Congress, in both the House and the Senate, about these issues. They are the most important issues, and too often presidents have made these decisions without appropriate consultation with the legislature.
Thank you so much, Dana. Thank you for your insight, your analysis, your experience, your expertise. We've definitely benefited from hearing from you and appreciate the partnership. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we will now be joined by the former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Dan Shapiro. Dan, welcome.
Thanks, Halie. Good to be with you.
Great. We'll just get right into it. You have said many times, Dan, this war did not begin 2 weeks ago. If you could explain the shadow war that you have talked about that was underway for so many years between Iran and Israel, and what occurred in the lead up to the Israeli strikes on Iran, I guess it was 13 days ago now.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really important bit of context that I have been trying to emphasize in a lot of discussions around the war that began ostensibly 13 days ago, but didn't really begin 13 days ago. It's been going on for a long time. That earlier version that you referenced as the shadow war refers to all of the years, really decades, that Iran has invested in, trained, armed, supported, and animated a network of terrorist organizations that have been their proxies to conduct their campaign against Israel. Of course, Iran this regime has called openly for Israel's destruction for years and years, had a countdown clock to its destruction pegged for 2040 in downtown Tehran. But their methodology for many years of actually inflicting pain on Israel was not direct, but through Hezbollah in Lebanon, through their support for Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza and in the West Bank, through their support for Shia militia groups in Iraq and Syria, through their support for the Houthis in Yemen. And this is sometimes known as the axis of resistance. This group of like-minded organizations were very much proxies and partners and again, tools of Iran to conduct their attacks against Israel. So for many years, attacks would be conducted. Sometimes rockets would be launched into Israel. Sometimes attacks would be terrorist attacks, if they could penetrate, would happen, or they would happen to Israelis outside of Israel. And Israel's method of combating that was to try to intercept obviously terrorist organizations before they would attack, also the weapon shipments, mostly through Syria on their way to Lebanon. And there were hundreds and hundreds of Israeli strikes on such shipments throughout the last decade. So that was the form this war took. But of course, last year, the war took a different turn and the cover was ripped off. And twice, Iran chose not to attack through proxies, not to use the deniable means of some other organization, even though they were the actor and funder behind it, but actually direct state-on-state acts of war, direct state-on-state violence. And specifically, I'm talking about on April 13th, when they launched 300 ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones toward Israel, an unprecedented barrage of those weapons to be used in a state-on-state attack. And then again on October 1st, when they doubled the number of ballistic missiles from the first attack, and there was a total of about 220 against Israel. In both cases, the United States worked carefully with Israel and with a coalition of other countries to help defend Israel from those attacks, and they were largely defeated. But the fact that they were largely defeated, and they weren't completely defeated, there were strikes within Israeli territory, but the fact that they were largely ineffective doesn't change the fact that Iran really changed the format by conducting state-on-state acts of war at that scale. Really, again, these are unprecedented volume and intensity of attacks. And so when you think about the context of the decision Israel made and ultimately the United States made to use force, that's really important context. If Iran is within a short distance, even if there's some debate about exactly how short a distance of being able to achieve a nuclear weapon, you have to put it in the context of a country that has already shown its willingness to conduct state-on-state acts of war. Imagine if any one of those missiles that were fired at Israel were tipped with a nuclear warhead, we'd be in a completely different world. So that's why I think we have to think carefully about everything that came before and how that informs the decisions made in light of the progress that Iran had also made in its nuclear weapons, in its nuclear program.
So now, 2 weeks later, we not only have had numerous Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear sites and now a US strike on 3 sites, which have unquestionably degraded Iran's nuclear capability. What is your assessment of the Israeli and American strikes on these Iranian sites? And what do you make of potentially the shifting objectives? Is regime change now also an objective of either the US or Israel when it comes to Iran?
I don't think regime change, I'm certain regime change is not the objective of the US strikes. As I heard Dana describing accurately, these were carefully targeted strikes on the nuclear facilities, special focus, of course, on the deeply buried underground enrichment facility at Fordo, which was the main target of the B-2s and the bunker busting weapons they carried. Also strikes on the Natanz and Isfahan facilities as well. So clearly for the U.S., that was the main focus, and President Trump, as quickly as he could, indicated that he was moving toward a ceasefire and negotiations. So I don't see regime change as being part of the U.S. strategy at all. And I don't really see it as the goal of the Israeli operation as well. The Israeli operation was mostly conducted on nuclear facilities, missile production and launch facilities and missile stocks, air defenses, senior military and IRGC leaders, senior nuclear scientists as well. That doesn't mean there weren't also strikes on symbols of regime power or institutions that help the regime repress its own people. That's an overlap with the institutions of the regime that project power and terror and aggression overseas as well. So there was some attempt to weaken those institutions, and there were some, I think, a little bit overheated statements from the prime minister and particularly the defense minister, Israel Katz, about the regime, but that wasn't evident in what they were actually doing militarily. So I don't see regime change as part of the operation to any significant degree. And so the concern of mission creep, the kinds of thing that people associate with our long presence in Iraq, when we invaded Iraq and we overthrew the government, and then we tried to stand up a new government and do the nation building exercise similarly in Afghanistan and ended up being there for a decade or two, is, I don't think, quite relevant, really relevant at all to this particular situation. Now, having said all of that, I will just say, I think it's important for us also to be clear about who this regime is and what they are about. This is a regime that, of course, came to power in 1979 with a deeply anti-American animus, took American hostages and held them at our embassy for over a year, has conducted the shadow war and decades of terror, supporting the organizations and the proxies to carry it out against Israel, against Americans, against Arabs in multiple countries, against their own people, against other countries of other citizens of other nationalities as well. There's a great deal of the blood of Israelis, Americans, Arabs, and Iranians and others on the hands of this regime. And the people of Iran deserve a better regime. Most scholars who study this peg the support of the regime among the Iranian public to be in the 15 to 20% range. And that's perfectly understandable given how brutal it has been, how often it has cracked down on different ethnic groups, on women, on freedom, democracy advocates, on all sorts of people who have tried to express their desire for a different and freer regime. There's a notorious prison in Evin prison in Tehran that I think the Israelis, which has been known to keep political prisoners, including Americans who have been held there for years on end and tortured and the like. So we should be clear-eyed about who the regime is and hope that its demise is near. The sooner that regime passes from the scene, the better. That will be a good day. But that's not the role of the United States or really any external actor to bring that about. That's something the Iranian people will have to figure out when and how and by what means they will do it. When the right fissures appear within the regime, when there's a sufficiently organized alternative, and at the appropriate time and in appropriate ways, we should be supporting the Iranian people. We should make sure they have the ability to communicate when the regime tries to shut down their access to the internet so they can't organize. We should be condemning regime abuses and sanctioning them for those abuses and calling them out for the human rights standards that all regimes, all governments should uphold. So we should be clear-eyed about who they are. We should, I think, aspire and hope the Iranian people will find their path and that we can find appropriate ways to support them to bring that regime to an end. But that's very, very different from talking about a regime change strategy or a regime change military operation, which I just don't see as the case in these last 2 weeks.
What do you make of the ceasefire that was imposed by President Trump? Is it sustainable, especially considering it was achieved outside of typical diplomatic channels and negotiations, and as Dana mentioned, without any sort of document for both sides to or terms to agree upon?
I think it's sustainable for the time being. It's something that came about because both sides needed it and wanted it. Israel, despite all of its successes, and it had tremendous successes fueled by incredible intelligence penetration and great skill of their pilots and other operators, also suffered serious blows during this conflict. 28, I believe, civilians were killed in the ballistic missile strikes. Hundreds of homes were destroyed. Thousands of people were injured. There may be additional damage we don't know about that took place on air bases or in critical infrastructure sites that may not have been open to the public. I'm not sure of that, but that's certainly possible as well. And Israel, of course, had to expend significant amounts of its interceptor inventory in order to protect its population, and the United States helped with that as well. We had THAAD batteries, a missile defense system on the ground in Israel. We had naval vessels offshore with ballistic missile defense capability to supplement. So Israel also needed an end, having largely completed the main mission of the operation, which was to degrade the nuclear and missile capabilities. Iran obviously needed the ceasefire because they were suffering so much from the blows from both Israel and the United States. And so I think neither of them has an interest in getting back into this conflict in the near term. That there's also a space for diplomacy, as Dana was mentioning, and maybe we'll get more to that, to find a way to make this a more stable off-ramp, if that's possible. Having said that, Israel, I think, will be very vigilant and will watch for any reconstitution of threats or threatening behavior. Of course, the ceasefire that Israel signed at the end of November with Hezbollah, or with the government of Lebanon, sort of on behalf of Hezbollah, was accompanied by a side letter between Israel and the United States, in which it was made clear if Israel sees violations of the ceasefire, sees Hezbollah continuing to arm or prepare to attack, it would take action, and it would have U.S. understanding and support if it needed to do that. I suspect a similar dynamic will take hold in this ceasefire, whether or not it's formalized in letters or side letters or understandings. I think this is a very much an Israeli mindset post October 7th, that it will not sit and watch threats gather and mature without intervening to try to set them back. So I think there's a reasonable chance there will be at least some limited Israeli action when it sees those threats. Of course, Iran may choose to try to respond to that. So there's always the risk of a kind of escalatory cycle and getting back into more sustained conflict operations. But since Iran suffered so badly, since Israel established its air superiority in Iran, I think it's not really in Iran's interest to get back into a very significant shooting war. So I think it will be reasonably stable, but there may be exceptions to it in specific instances.
So we certainly saw over the past 2 weeks the absolutely essential missile defense systems that the U.S. and Israel have jointly developed. I think hundreds, over 400 Iranian missiles were shot at Israel, the vast majority of which were intercepted. But as you mentioned, this has no doubt depleted Israel's stockpile of those interceptors. So, what do you think Israel will need in the coming months from the U.S. as it builds up its defensive stockpiles of interceptors and other items that are so critical to its defense? And what role does the administration and Congress play in this regard in terms of ensuring that Israel can continue to defend itself?
Well, I don't have obviously the numbers of what was expended, but I'm sure it was significant. But there is a significant amount of assistance in the pipeline. Recall, I'm sure many people on this call were involved as advocates or supporters last year, late 2023 and through the spring of 2024, for the supplemental appropriation bill that President Biden proposed following the October 7th attacks. That was about a $14.5 billion package of assistance for Israel, much of it allowing us to draw down U.S. stocks of equipment, not interceptors. That's not something we keep stock of, but artillery and various other aerial munitions and the like. But the supplemental appropriation included, I think it was $4.5 billion in additional money for Arrow and Iron Dome and David Sling, and a new system, a laser system called Iron Beam. And that was largely to replenish stocks that had already been drawn down during the early phases of the war. And so that money is now sort of in Israel's hands, but probably much of it hasn't been spent yet. It takes significant time to do this manufacturing and this production. So I assume it is coming, and but there will be a good discussion between the United States and Israel about whether additional monies are needed for additional replenishment of those missile defense systems. Obviously, the numbers are daunting because we saw that Iran had something like 2,000 medium-range ballistic missiles that could reach Israel. Israel was able to destroy some on the ground, destroy many of the launchers, and therefore limit the volume that could be shot. But Iran has the ability to produce many more of these ballistic missiles. So, we're talking about a heavy lift to come up with a sufficient interceptor inventory to make sure that they can be properly defended. I think it was fairly successful, but even so, there were gaps this time. So the right people will do the assessment, see what the numbers already in train look like, see what needs to be added to that, and if there's a need for additional supplemental appropriation, obviously that's something to be worked out between the administration and Congress. I'll just say that we're in, I think, year 7 or 8, year 8 of the Memorandum of Understanding, the MOU, that I helped negotiate during the Obama administration. It was signed in 2016, started in 2019, and that provided a steady stream of $500 billion of $500 million annually, so a total of $5 billion over the 10 years of the MOU for all of Israel's missile defense programs. That was then supplemented first after the 2021 Israel-Gaza war, the brief war, with about $1 billion of additional assistance, and then that was supplemented again by the $4.5 billion of the supplemental from 2024. That was envisioned when we negotiated the MOU that the steady state of the $500 million a year would be the base. But if and when the countries looked at circumstances, looked at expenditures, look at threats, and determined that on an emergency basis, additional monies would be needed, that they could together agree on that, and the administration could approach Congress and make that request. So that's still in effect, and is something that, if it's necessary, can be exercised. And then, of course, it's not too long before the administration and Israel should be negotiating the next MOU. And so I assume and hope that the next MOU will think ahead, looking at this last 2 years of experience about how to structure the funding streams for Israel's FMF, foreign military financing, which is for the planes and the other equipment, and then the ballistic missile defense funding, which is sort of a separate stream, and include both in the MOU.
Thank you. And thank you for all the work that you did to ensure Israel's ability to defend itself. The missile defense systems in particular have been quite remarkable in saving thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives. It has been almost 630 days since October 7th, and there are still 50 hostages in Gaza. What are the implications of Israel's war with Iran on Israel's military campaign in Gaza and potentially on efforts to release the hostages, something we, of course, continue to call for and are not giving up on? And do you think the Trump administration now has leverage it could assert to bring about a ceasefire and a release of the hostages in Gaza?
I do. I think this is a real opportunity to leverage the end of this war between Israel and Iran, and the U.S. role in it, to try to bring the war in Gaza to an end. There's two ways that can function. First, of course, Iran is demonstrated to be weaker than ever and very vulnerable. And that means that there's the possibility that Hamas, one of Iran's proxies and client groups, will assess that they don't have the same support that they had been counting on, and that might lead them, or maybe even Iran would be convinced to pressure them. That's also a possibility that might emerge from U.S.-Iranian negotiations, to relax their terms, or be more flexible in the terms of the hostage and ceasefire deal than what they've been demanding. We saw that dynamic a bit after Hezbollah's decimation in the fall. Once Hezbollah was really out of the war, the Iranian negotiating posture became more flexible, and that helped produce the hostage deal that happened in January, just before President Trump's inauguration. But President Trump also has leverage, and it's leverage with Israel. It's leverage with other parties as well. I think anytime the United States shows it's willing to act with strength, and willing to stand with partners, and willing to confront adversaries, it gives the president a certain amount of leverage, especially in the short term, to try to capture upon. Particularly in the case of Israel, he has done something obviously very meaningful for Israel's security, and in cooperation with the prime minister. It's not out of the question at all for the president to say to the prime minister, in light of everything we've been through together, I need your help, and I need your flexibility in the terms you're insisting on in the hostage and ceasefire deal, to bring the war to an end. The president has spoken about his desire to see the war end. What has been on the table for negotiation prior to this war was what's called the Witkoff proposal. It's more of a midterm solution, or not solution, midterm agreement, 60 days, 10 live hostages, some number of the deceased hostages as well. Some aid flow in during the 60 days, but no guarantee that at the end of the 60 days, we don't go right back to more fighting, more time putting the remaining hostages who are alive at risk, more difficulty handling the humanitarian situation in Gaza. So there really is an opening here to leverage what just happened to bring the war to an end. It's got to include release of all hostages. It's got to mean a significant inflow of aid to people in Gaza who desperately need it. And it also has to include a plan for the exile of the remaining Hamas leaders and fighters. Arab states can be very helpful here. There was Arab interest in trying to work on what we're calling day after proposals for Gaza earlier in the year when President Trump had made his, I think, sort of ill-founded Gaza Riviera proposal, which isn't obviously going to happen or go anywhere. But it did lead Arab states to try to put together an alternative. That alternative had some interesting features and also had some significant elements that it was lacking. And one of those was clarity on the removal of Hamas from power, the disarming of Gaza, so that it can't be the threat that it was to Israel on October 7th. So, but I think there's an opportunity again to leverage through diplomacy the events of the last 2 weeks to also get the Arab states to be more forward-leaning on how they would contribute to putting those arrangements in place. So I'm very hopeful. It's something I think all Israelis I know are kind of desperately looking forward to is the end. When hostages are home, they can exhale about that. When they don't have to worry about more soldiers losing their lives. Tragically, 7 Israeli soldiers were killed today in Gaza, and this has been going on now for 21 months. So the outcomes need to be the same outcomes: hostages home, humanitarian aid to Gazans, reconstruction for those who live in Gaza who want to live peacefully with Israel, and removal of Hamas from power. But it doesn't necessarily have to be dragging through many, many more months of war to get there. We can use diplomacy, leveraging what just happened to achieve the same results.
Thank you, Dan. And now the final question, very similar to the question that we asked Dana regarding what's happening here at home in response to the president's strikes over the weekend. There's clearly a robust debate about the constitutionality of the strikes without prior congressional authorization or approval or even coordination discussion. Apparently nothing was discussed with Democrats in Congress. What do you make of this debate and potentially the upcoming votes that will occur on war powers authorization?
So I agree with what Dana said. I caught that end of her presentation, and I agree with the following, that it's really the right practice for the executive branch to consult with members of Congress, not every member of Congress, but leadership on both sides of the aisle, leadership of key committees, when contemplating using military force overseas. This is, to Dana's point, the responsibility of both branches of our government, of the elected representatives of our people, whose constituents are among those being deployed, being put in harm's way. And they should know what is happening to as significant a degree as can be shared. Obviously, some things have to be done in classified settings. You don't want to, if necessary, lose the element of surprise, which might have been relevant in this case. But there are ways of having those conversations. It does not appear that that was happening. Maybe some very last-minute heads-ups to the Republican leaders, to the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader, but not the kind of consultation that is best practice between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Now, having said that, it is also true that almost every president in my lifetime, and it may go back longer than that, but certainly in my adult lifetime, has at different times used military force without a congressional authorization. Sometimes the authorizations come, sometimes some kind of less than authorization, but sort of informal endorsement occurs. Sometimes presidents act on timely matters without receiving any direction or conclusion or statement of support or non-support from members from the Congress before they act. And that is, I think, a feature, not a bug, of our constitutional system. All presidents claim the authority under Article 2 of the Constitution as commander-in-chief to use the military to address threats and act in self-defense. There's always some definitional question of whether a particular operation falls into those categories or not, but administrations and the lawyers who serve administrations tend to define that fairly broadly. And quite frequently, members of Congress, and especially members of Congress opposite the party and president, but some members of Congress, no matter who's president, will say, look, we also have a constitutional role here, and we have a right to speak and authorize. Certainly, only Congress can declare war. That's clear in the Constitution. But most of our military operations don't involve a declaration of war. That has only happened a handful of times in our history, last either in World War II or Korea. So it's understandable that you have those tensions. It's understandable that members of Congress will express their desire to speak. There's certainly their desire to have been given more information before the action, and even now after, to get the intelligence and get the battle damage assessments and get all that information they need to evaluate what happened. That also should be shared. It sounds like those briefings have not happened yet, and they need to. That's very important. But I don't think the fundamental situation of an administration acting in this way, Congress feeling like it was a little bit left out, is so unusual. It's really quite a common occurrence in our constitutional system. So I don't know what will happen in these votes. It may be that some members will vote that they want to do this, which I think is called a joint resolution of disapproval under the War Powers Act. If it happens to pass, which as I think is not very likely, the president can veto it, and it would take a 2/3 majority to overturn it. The resolution largely is outdated already because it calls for removing U.S. forces from hostilities when our U.S. forces, who very bravely and professionally executed this operation, have already left the battlefield and are safely home. So it's not clear that there's all that much practical relevance to it, but for some members to make that statement and have that on the record, and maybe it's an indicator of how Congress wants to be approached or feels it should be approached in future actions, members are going to make their own different decisions on how to vote on it. I think in the end, it won't have a direct impact very much because it largely is about an event that's already concluded.
Well, thank you so much, Dan, for sharing your expertise, your insight, your lifelong commitment to ensuring Israel's security, its right to self-defense, which we share. We are really grateful to you for your leadership. Thank you.
Thanks, Halie. Good to be with everybody.
Thank you. I will now turn things over to our Chief Program Officer, Bobby Saferstein, to close today's event.
Thanks, Halie. And thanks to Dana Stroul, Ambassador Dan Shapiro, and each of you for joining us for today's conversation on the war between Israel and Iran and the role of the United States. As we continue to monitor the situation in Israel, Iran, Gaza, and throughout the Middle East, it's also essential that we not lose sight of other critical developments here at home. Right now, Republicans in Congress are gutting the U.S. healthcare system and cutting billions of dollars from Medicaid and vital social services, leaving millions of Americans in danger of losing access to critical care. Meanwhile, the Trump administration continues to erode our democratic institutions, freedoms, and protections, aided by the Supreme Court's recent rulings, which puts thousands of undocumented immigrants in danger of torture in countries they have no connection to, and depriving members of the LGBTQ+ community of the life-saving care they need. There's a lot going on. But here at JDCA, we're staying engaged and taking action. Here are 3 ways you can take action with us right now. 1, to keep up with the latest developments in the Middle East and here at home, follow JDCA on all of our social media platforms: Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky, Twitter, Substack, TikTok, and YouTube. We also encourage you to share our posts and help us get our message out to your networks. 2, please visit our Action Center at jewishdems.org/action to write to your members of Congress and join JDCA's efforts on a myriad of issues Jewish voters care most about. To join us, please click on the link in the chat. And 3, if you aren't yet a JDCA member, please consider becoming one or increasing your membership level to support our work. JDCA members access special benefits such as members-only programs with leading experts and analysts, such as today's conversation. To become a JDCA member, please click on the link in the chat. As we close out today's program, we continue to pray for the 50 hostages being held by Hamas in Gaza and demand they be released now. We also pray for the safety and security of all of those in Israel, our U.S. troops and diplomats in the region, and innocent civilians throughout the Middle East whose lives have been turned upside down or worse, lost as a result of war. Thank you again for joining JDCA. Wishing everyone a Pride Sameach these final days of June, and we'll see you again soon.